All right, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am Amanda Sternberg. I'm with the Homeless Action Network of Detroit, or HAND. HAND, for those of you who may not be familiar, we are the CoC lead agency in Detroit. We also fulfill the roles of the collaborative applicant, the HMIS lead, and the coordinated entry lead. So we play a number of different roles in the CoC. Again, like I said, one of it, which is being the collaborative applicant, which is why we are leading this process for the CoC Builds funding opportunity. So thank you all for being here today. So I'm going to go over just what we're going to be talking about today. As I go along, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand or come off of mute and just ask questions along the way. So this is a rough outline of what we're going to be talking about. What I'm going to be going over will essentially align with the application materials that I just sent out yesterday and that are posted to our website. I'll put the link in our website before the end of our meeting here today. So understand if you've not had a chance to look over those materials thoroughly, but essentially that's what we're going over today. So we're going to talk about what is CoC Builds, who's eligible to apply, some things to keep in mind regarding project timing, who's to be served, what the application process and the timeline is for all of that. I'm going to talk a bit about, I guess I have target populations on there twice. Sorry about that. I'm going to talk a bit about some requirements as it relates to the funding requests that we're going to want to be seeing from applicants and some additional local CoC requirements. And then lastly, I'm going to highlight some questions within the application itself and the funding request budget form that you are going to be asked to submit. So we'll go over some of those materials in detail. Again, everything that I'm talking about today will be posted to our website, and I'll make sure that that link is dropped in the chat before the end of our meeting. This recording of this webinar, as well as the slides, will also be posted to our website by early next week. And the application itself is already posted there. Also, the kind of Word version that you will be filling out and submitting to us, and the funding request spreadsheet is posted there as well. So to also kind of start us off, the first kind of the most important date for folks to keep in mind is application due date. They are due to hand by noon on September 30th. That's a Monday. If you've been around, you may have previously seen or heard a September 27th deadline. We've extended that out just over the weekend to that Monday. So Monday, September 30th, if you are going to apply, everything is due to me by then, by noon. Please note of that time. We do need your application submitted by noon on Monday, the 30th. And everything is to be emailed to me. Again, I'll go over some additional instructions later on around application submission, but just so you have that September 30th deadline in mind. Okay, so what is CoC Builds? So for those of you who may not have had a chance to read HUD's NOFO or anything about this, CoC Builds is an opportunity to apply to HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, for CoC funding to develop permanent supportive housing, or PSH. This is an opportunity for entities to receive funding for capital cost to develop the PSH building. That is what the majority of the funding request does need to be. These funds can be spread out over the course of several years. The initial grant term can be anywhere from 2 to 5 years. So it allows some time to receive those funds and then utilize those funds. Also, up to 20% of that budget request may be for services, operations, or project-based rental assistance. So kind of that combined total of those three cost types can comprise up to 20% of the request. The really kind of exciting thing about this is because these are continuum of care dollars, after the end of that initial grant term, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years, those non-capital costs, so operating services, rental assistance, are renewable under the typical CoC competition. Capital cost and associated admin amounts are not renewable, but these other costs are renewable. So that's really exciting. It's an opportunity to get more CoC funding kind of incorporated into our local continuum of care. So some additional context on this opportunity: Detroit can apply for up to $7.5 million. Again, that can be spread out over several years. We may only submit one application to HUD. So this is a little bit different than other funding opportunities that you may be familiar with CoC funding, where we can submit multiple applications. For CoC Builds, we can only submit one. This is a highly competitive funding opportunity nationally. HUD is going to be prioritizing funding a number of projects in rural communities, which obviously is not going to apply to Detroit. So because of that, sort of the remaining funding that they have for non-rural communities is going to be even more competitive. So we're going to be throwing our hat in the ring with a lot of other CoCs, which means we want to be able to put forward to HUD the strongest application possible. I touched on this briefly, but the allowable costs that can be requested are listed here. I provide some links in the application materials that go into more details on what you can use these costs for. We're not going to go in necessarily into that level of detail today. If you do have any questions about that, you can always reach out to me. But essentially, these types of costs that can be requested: acquisition, to acquire a property; new construction, rehabilitation. Hopefully those are pretty self-explanatory on what those mean. Project-based rental assistance can be requested. That would, to provide an ongoing rental subsidy for the property after the rehab is completed. Operating and supportive services, and then admin as well. So again, in sum, these are the types of costs that can be requested. So locally, the Detroit CoC has established some eligibility criteria that we're going to be looking at for applications that are going to be submitted to us. And so these are 5 criteria that applicants need to meet in order for us to consider their application. I'll touch briefly on why for some of these. Some might be self-explanatory. 1, the applicant must be a unit of government, a public housing agency, public housing authority, or a nonprofit organization. Those are HUD's requirements. The project site must be in Detroit, Hamtramck, or Highland Park. That is the jurisdiction of our continuum of care. So the site needs to be within that jurisdiction. So these next 3 are more local eligibility criteria that we have put in place. So the third one is that the applicant must have experience developing at least one other PSH or affordable housing project in a similar size and scale to the one being proposed in this application. HUD is going to be looking for applications in which the applicant has pretty extensive experience in developing these types of projects. And so we decided, just as a baseline for our local application, we wanted to see an applicant that has experience developing at least one other project. We'll see in a little bit, there's a question in the application that gets to this experience question, where more points can be earned for greater level of experience. But just as sort of a baseline, again, kind of threshold requirement, the applicant needs to have developed at least one other PSH or affordable housing project of a similar scale. The 4th criterion is that the funding request must include a request for supportive services. As I mentioned earlier, because these services are renewable in the CoC competition, we really want applicants to take advantage of that opportunity to get more of those renewable funds folded into our community. And so therefore, we are going to expect to see those funding requests include some level of request for supportive services. So a request that comes through just requesting capital costs is not going to be considered. The 5th eligibility criteria for the applicant eligibility criteria is that we will not be considering projects that are an occupied rehab. So projects where there are residents or people kind of currently living in the space that needs to be rehabbed, those are not going to be considered. And this is largely due to a timing issue. We're going to get in a moment to sort of how the timing of where a project is really important. We know that if there are people living in a building that have to be moved, that's going to trigger different requirements in terms of moving them, finding other housing for them, and that can take some time. And we just don't have really the time to be able to manage that with the timeline in which these funds would need to be spent. So for that matter, for our purposes here, we're not going to be considering projects that are, again, an occupied rehab. All right, so project timing considerations. I alluded to this just now. So these are, again, these dollars, these CoC Build dollars are Continuum of Care dollars. So they are subject to the Continuum of Care regulations. And within those regulations, there are certain timeliness standards that need to be met in order for those funds to be spent within the timeline that HUD expects. So because of these timeliness standards, there's kind of these certain benchmarks or certain points along the way where a project needs to be kind of in its process in order for it to be competitive both in our local application and with HUD. So projects that are able to demonstrate alignment with these timelines are going to be more competitive locally and with HUD. Again, that doesn't mean that if you can't exactly align with these timelines, we won't consider your application when you submit it. It's just that it may not score as high as another project. So let me just kind of run through these, what they are. So one, we're going to be looking to see if the project currently has site control or is anticipated to be able to get site control by August of 2025. So like a year from now. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned as well, for those projects that are funded, we expect HUD to issue grant agreements by September of 2025. So shortly before that is when the project would need to have site control. We then are going to be looking to see if the project has phase 1 and phase 2 of their environmental review completed by June of 2026, and then with construction or rehab able to begin shortly thereafter. So we know that environmental rehab can, once you get in there and discover what's really going on with a site, that can then take some time as well to remediate those issues, get those issues taken care of before you can really begin a lot of the work that needs to be done. We're also going to be looking to see the extent to which the project will be able to complete that construction and rehab by September of 2027. And then be looking to see if they anticipate leasing up to be able to begin no later than January of 2028. So again, we put these kind of timeline expectations in place because with the CoC funding, it's not the type of funding where you can receive it and then just kind of let it sit dormant for several years until you're ready to spend it and ready to start rehabbing. Again, it's subject to certain timeliness standards within the CoC regulations. And so because of that, we're really going to be most interested in projects that are able to demonstrate an alignment with this timeline. And again, we'll see questions in the application that will kind of get to where a project is in the timeline. So let's talk a bit about the application process locally here, kind of what we're doing in Detroit. How we're handling this CoC Builds process in Detroit may be different than how other CoCs are handling it. This is how we're doing it here. So because I referenced earlier, we can only submit one application to HUD. We're doing this in 2 phases, essentially. So phase 1 is really what we're talking about here today. So this application process, what you're going to be submitting by September 30th, that's phase 1. So the applications, again, that are submitted later this month will be reviewed, will be scored. Based on that review, a recommendation will be made to the CoC board at their October 7th board meeting on which one application we want to move forward with to submit to HUD. So then we will enter into phase 2. And phase 2 is really only going to involve that one applicant and working with us and the city to develop the full narrative that needs to be submitted to HUD. The actual application that's submitted to HUD is not the application that you're going to be submitting to hand by the 30th. The actual application that's given to HUD is detailed in the CoC Builds NOFO. It's much more extensive. It's much longer. For our local process here, we wanted to scale that back a little bit just to allow us to really drill in on the key things that we wanted to see in a project for our decision-making purpose. But for the applicant that's selected to move on to phase 2, they will then enter into writing that full narrative response that needs to be submitted to HUD. It will be the applicant's responsibility to write that. We'll have a process where we'll go back and forth, provide editing and input and suggestions, but writing that full narrative, there's 3 supplemental narratives that need to be submitted and HUD's budget form, those will all be the responsibility of the selected applicant entity to write and develop and ultimately have ready for submission to HUD by, I think November 18. So that's something to keep in mind. And we'll talk about the timeline in a minute as well. But something to keep in mind that if you are selected, this initial phase is only the first phase. You'll then be spending a good part of October and November writing this narrative response that needs to be submitted to HUD. Due to the way that HUD has structured this CoC Builds opportunity, HAND as the collaborative applicant is the entity that ultimately has to submit the application. We need to submit it through grants.gov. So for whatever reason, this is how HUD has structured it. The collaborative applicant is technically the one who's submitting it to HUD. However, if that application is funded, the grant agreement will be between HUD and the applicant. So once it's submitted to HUD, HAND's role as the collaborative applicant kind of ends in terms of getting the application submitted. And if that application is funded, again, the grant agreement will be between HUD and that agency. So here's broad outline of the timeline that we're looking at. Again, these phase 1 applications are due on September 30th by noon, with the board making their decision on which one to move forward with on October 7th. Then, as you can see, during sort of like the rest of October, those following kind of 3 weeks, the selected applicant is going to really start working on writing that full narrative response. We will then have kind of a sort of a 2-week time period where there will be a review of that response. We'll definitely have HAND, our partners with the city of Detroit, reviewing that narrative response just to make sure that, again, we're submitting the strongest application as possible. So there'll be some, back and forth during those couple of weeks with making edits, strengthening the narrative as needed. By November 18th, we're going to need the final narrative. There's 3 supplemental narratives that are also required but not scored, and a budget form, HUD's budget form, that will need to be submitted to HAND so that we can get it submitted to HUD by November 19th. I think HUD's deadline is like November 21st or November 20th, but we're aiming to get it submitted a day or so early. We anticipate HUD will make their funding announcements in early 2025 and then have those grant agreements in place by September of 2025. Okay, so the target pop, I'm just gonna keep going along. But again, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions. So the target population to be served in these projects, again, this is permanent supportive housing. I'm not really going to take a lot of time here to go into what is permanent supportive housing or what is PSH. My assumption is that for those who are developing PSH, if you're on this call, that you are familiar with this model of service, this type of housing. If that is new to you, I can provide you some links. You can get more information on what is PSH, but we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what is permanent supportive housing. But the target population, so who are the clients who are going to be served in these units? So the target population are people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. So again, that's going to be folks that have a disabling condition and they have a long history of homelessness. Additionally, people are going to be referred to your projects in accordance with our local coordinated entry or CAM prioritization policies and procedures. So we have a local prioritization process where people who have the highest needs for housing are the ones who are referred to permanent supportive housing first. So those are the individuals who are going to be referred to these projects. So the referral process is going to look the same as it will for any other CoC funded permanent supportive housing project. So I touched on this briefly, but wanted to just sort of reiterate in terms of the funding request that we're going to want to see. I do have, be going over in a minute, the spreadsheet that you're going to have to complete and submit to us. But again, we are going to be requiring that your funding request must include a request for capital costs. That is one of the key components of this funding opportunity, is that it allows for capital costs. And we also are expecting to see some supportive services costs in there as well. And again, I referenced this earlier. These supportive services funding it's so key to the stability of the people you're going to be serving. CoC's services funding is, in some ways, I think a lot of providers feel is sort of like the gold standard of services funding, because there's a pretty significant level of flexibility to it. And again, they're renewable. So we are expecting to see that request come through with some supportive services funding. And the last bullet point there, that is HUD's requirement that no more than 20% of the combined request for services, operations, or project-based rental assistance cannot be more than 20% of your total funding request. All right, I see a question in the box. Does 100% of the units need to be for people experiencing chronic homelessness? So no, if you could have I'll say no with a caveat, I think I'm interpreting your question correctly. You can have a building that has, I think HUD uses the phrase integrated units. I've heard the phrase mixed use before. I think mixed use is a little misleading, because you often think of that as like you have retail space on the bottom and apartments on the upper floors. But suffice to say, if you have a property where you have a certain number of units, some of those units are permanent supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless. Some of those units are for low income, affordable housing, that would be acceptable. But for those units that are permanent supportive housing, PSH, those PSH units will be serving people who are chronically homeless. Those units will be the ones receiving referrals from coordinated entry in accordance with our coordinated entry prioritization. So, if I didn't answer that accurately, Jamie, let me know. Okay, I want to talk a minute about the match requirements. So because these are CoC funds are subject to a 25% match. That's a regulatory requirement, and that's no different for these projects as well. So the total amount of whatever that request is will need to have a 25% match. So if the project is requesting that whole $7.5 million, which we are hopeful it will, you're looking at a match of about $1.8 million. So the match can be pretty sizable. Again, I keep referring to this spreadsheet that I made. I think I really love this spreadsheet, but that will show you how the match is calculated as well. So also, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of here on this call in terms of what you can use as match. I do have a link in the application materials that will take you to HUD's website that goes into a lot greater detail on what you can use as match. It can be both cash or in kind. There's different documentation standards on how to document match. Match can be sort of its whole thing in and of itself, but just know that there is a match requirement. I want to talk briefly about the MSHDA, Michigan State Housing Development Authority match opportunity. Some of you may be familiar with this if you get the emails from MSHDA, or if you were on MSHDA's webinar earlier this week. MSHDA has created an opportunity for the matching funds for applications that are selected by the CoC to be submitted to HUD. So the entities who would be eligible for this MSHDA match the MISTA match are entities that are already participating in MISTA's direct lending program. MISTA has indicated that this match will be in the form of a tax exempt loan. And you will see a question in the application that will ask if you intend to take advantage of this match, if you fit those criteria. If you as an applicant choose to take advantage of this opportunity, and if your application is selected, then HAND will manage the process of informing MISTA of this and kind of take care of those logistics. So there's no request that you as an applicant agency need to make at this time to MISTA. You don't have to go to MISTA and say, hey, I want this match. That will come kind of after the fact. If your application is selected, we'll kind of manage the process then. I provided a link in the application materials to some more information on MISTA's direct lending programs. I'm going to be very transparent and say this is an area of expertise that I don't have a full area of knowledge. I don't have a lot of expertise in. So I want to be mindful of not going into a lot of details on what this match will look like or what it will entail, because I don't want to give anyone false information. I'm entering into this right now with the assumption that if you as an agency are currently participating in MISTA's direct lending program, that you know that is a fact about your organization that you are already aware of. If you do have questions about the MISTA match, feel free to email me and I can facilitate getting a response from MISTA regarding that. That's kind of the extent of what I can share about the MISTA match opportunity right now. My understanding is that MISTA will, based on the outcome of the call that we had earlier this week, that they may be providing additional guidance in writing. Once I have that guidance, if it is provided in the relatively near future, I will post that to HAND's website, where you'll find this other CoC Builds information. Okay, I'm going to take a moment to look at some of the additional questions in the chat. So the question is, since this is for capital costs, not just services, I'm guessing that match can include capital costs, which we've already been awarded funding. Is this accurate? Yes. So your match, whatever source you use for match, needs to be a source of funding that could be used for any eligible continuum of care activity. So let's use capital costs like rehab as an example. So if you are receiving, say, city home dollars, and if there's for rehab or those capital costs, and as long as there's no restrictions that you've received from the city on those dollars, that those dollars cannot be used as match, that could be a matching source. So whether it's home or another source of funding for rehab or capital costs, those could be used as your match. So really, match, again, can be used for anything that would otherwise be an eligible cost under the CoC competition. Likewise, if you have a matching source, so let's kind of, I guess, keep with this sort of home dollars example. Say you request a 5-year budget, and within the first 2 years, you're going to be spending your rehab dollars to rehab the building. And then in years 3 through 5, you're going to be spending your supportive services funds to serve the people in that building. If you are using, again, say like home dollars or another source of funding as a match that was used for your rehab, you would essentially be showing that you've met your match obligation within the first couple of years of the entire grant term, and that would be acceptable. For this initial grant term, you don't have to show that 25% match each year of the grant, as long as it's a 25% at some point over the course of that entire grant term. When that term then kind of clicks over to 1-year cycles, your match obligation will kind of re-up, but the 25% will then just be based on the 1 year's worth of funding that you would receive going forward. And the second part of Jamie's question, do you have to do 25% match and a 25% for services? So your match is your 25% of your total budget request. So whatever your total request is, it's a 25% match overall. It's not a line by line match. It's so for those of you who perhaps currently receive CoC funding, maybe think of it if you have like a services line item and a rental assistance line item and an admin line item. You know that you have to provide 25% match for that in total budget, but you're not necessarily matching 25% for services, 25% for rental, and 25% for admin. It's the sum total is of what you have to match is 25% of your total budget. So I hope that makes sense. Again, match can be a little sticky. Okay, and then another question, since services won't begin until the building was ready for lease up, first, could the first year or two of the grant be for capital costs, and the only thing we'd be drawing down in the third year would be services? Yes. Yep. Absolutely. It's because you know, obviously you think about if you're rehabbing a building, people aren't going to be living in that building until the rehab is done and you're ready to lease up. And so you're not going to be spending your supportive services funds until you're ready to actually start serving people. So you're going to need to think through the budget in terms of, okay, if I want 3 years or 5 years worth of funding, I think the rehab is going to take, you know, 1 or 2 of those years. And then after that, I'll be done with the rehab. And the rest of the years, I'm going to be providing the services. Yep. So you'll need to kind of think through what that timeline and what that time frame is going to look like. So last couple of things that I want to talk about before we switch over to looking at the application, and just some, again, requirements that you all need to be aware of if you are selected by HUD to be for these funds. So HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System. Again, these are CoC dollars, so use of HMIS is required. So client level data will need to be entered into HMIS. There is a whole host of trainings that we can provide if your agency is new to this. Excuse me, but just be aware that the HMIS requirements are there, and they can be a bit extensive. I mean, it's maybe a little less for permanent supportive housing because you're not going to have as much turnover as in other programs, but there definitely are different data quality standards that we're going to be holding you to. There are different reporting obligations that you are going to have to comply with, and so just be aware of, again, these HMIS requirements. The unfortunate part with CoC Builds is that HUD did not build in a specific HMIS budget line for applicants to request funding for HMIS. I don't know why. That was just an oversight on HUD's part, but just, I guess, be mindful of that. HMIS will be required, but unfortunately, HUD did not build that into a budget line this year. So coordinated entry, I alluded to this as well. So coordinated entry, this is known locally as CAM. You may be familiar with that term. This is the process by which your project will receive referrals to fill your vacancies. And units, again, these permanent supportive housing units may only be filled with vacancies that come from CAM. This is something we monitor. This is something we can see. We can tell if you're filling your units with folks that do not come through coordinated entry. So don't try to do it because we can tell. But again, you will receive referrals to these units in accordance with our local prioritization process, which again, we prioritized people who are the most vulnerable, the most in need to these units. Now, if you're developing a project that has, 1-bedroom units and 2-bedroom units, multi-bedroom units, the referrals will also be in alignment with the size of the household that can be accommodated in that unit. So that is something that will be certainly taken into consideration with these referrals. If you just have 1-bedroom units, we're not going to refer you, a 5-person household. So that is, something that we certainly take into consideration. But just know that use of coordinated entry is required. Maybe a simple way to put this is that you do not control your front door with these projects in terms of who gets in. They all will come through coordinated entry. If your agency is new to coordinated entry in Detroit, this is something you're not familiar with. There will be a lot of training and orientation on how coordinated entry works and what this will mean for your project if you're funded. Okay, I'm just pausing for a couple of questions in the, actually, I think that some of these I'm gonna wait for the question until we get to the application. So again, applications are due to me by 12 o'clock noon on September 30th. So again, I'm asking everything to be emailed to me. You have my email address there. You are welcome to send more than one email. Sometimes if you're sending multiple attachments, the size of that email can become a little bit larger. So you're welcome to send more than one email. Just label them like email 1 of 3 or 2 of 3, what have you. You're also welcome to send things through via a zip file as well, if that works easier for you. So either way, whatever you feel most comfortable with, they're due by noon. Would encourage you to not wait till the last minute. We really try to be intentional with the questions that we put in the application to find this balance between us getting the sort of basic information that we needed to make our decision, while also not kind of overburdening you as an applicant as you're putting your applications together, given the short time frame. So hopefully we found that balance. Okay, I'm going to switch over. Let me do two things right now. I'm going to switch over and walk through the application and the funding spreadsheet, but I do also want to drop in the chat this website. Let me just quick show this. This is the CoC Builds website where I'll be posting everything. I would encourage you to bookmark this website on your browser. You do need to know how to get to it. Unfortunately, it's a little buried, but if you go to the main Continuum of Care funding page, this is where we typically post everything regarding the normal CoC competition, the standard CoC competition. And you'll see I just have a link here that will then redirect you to the CoC Builds page. So for easier access, just bookmark this CoC Builds page in your browser, and you'll be able to get it to it quickly. But here is where this recording and the slides will be posted by early next week. The application itself, the RFP and the application in the PDF format are posted. The Word version of the application is there, as well as the funding request spreadsheet. So everything that you need is there. Okay, I want to walk through parts of the application and just really highlight some kind of information here that will hopefully be helpful to you as you work on your project. So I'm going to kind of skip through the first few pages because that is really everything we just covered in the slides. So as I also get into this, I want to, so there's a question that came through in terms of whether or not Detroit would consider there being multiple projects or multiple sites in one application. So we would consider that. I don't know that we really specified that in our application materials, but if you are proposing multiple sites in one application, you'll need to indicate that, and then where there are questions related to the project site, you would essentially need to answer those questions twice or more than once, depending on how many sites there are. Likewise, if there are, documents related to a site like site control, and if you have more than one site, you would need to submit that documentation for each of the sites. So we're not going to say, no, you can only do one site. You can include more than one site in the application. You would just need to really make it clear kind of in your responses, like which response is referring to which site that you're talking about. I'm going to go over the required attachments later on, but just know we have sort of this checklist to hopefully help keep you organized as you go about and put your application together. So the first little bit of the application is pretty straightforward. It's asking for basic contact information about the applicant and the project. So again, it's going to ask for the address of the project site. Also ask for information on key partners and potential subrecipients. So we are asking for information on who's the developer, who's the service provider, and who is the property manager. If at the point of your project you don't yet have this determined, just make a note of that kind of in the box. Again, because of where we're expecting these projects to be in their process, we are hoping that at this point, for the most part, this information is known in terms of who these different project partners are on the process. There's a question around subrecipients. It is our, I guess in some ways, an assumption that there will be subrecipients on these projects where the applicant will directly receive the funding and then they will sub those dollars out to the subrecipients. So we're going to want to know who is the subrecipient, what is their role, and what is the how much of this funding that's being requested would they receive. I do make a note in the RFP materials. I referenced this a little bit. If you do have a subrecipient, the applicant, who then is the grantee, would need to enter into a subrecipient arrangement with that sub, and you are then subject to all of HUD's requirements as it relates to managing subrecipients. So, processing reimbursements, monitoring the subrecipients, again, having that subrecipient agreement in place. So just be mindful of that there is an added level of kind of expectation to have a subrecipient, added level of management that needs to be done with those subs. So then just asking about what costs are you requesting and what grant term what is the term of the grant that you're requesting. I give the approximate years of these grant terms just to kind of help sort of shape your thinking. So the application questions, I'm gonna try to not go over all of these, because I know, well, we have time, so we'll just go through these. So section kind of question 1, this is really questions getting into questions around the timeline. So as I say as well, the information that you provide, we're gonna compare that to information we already know about your project. And we may know that information because you've applied for tax credit, so you've come through the CoC's PSH review process, or perhaps you are working with the city, you've received home dollars, or you're applying with the city to the city for home dollars, or there's other information that we know about your project in terms of the timeline. So we're going to compare that information that you provide to us, again, with the information that we already have a sense of. If things seem to be wildly a wild disconnect, we may go back to get further clarification. We know things change, in your timeline with these processes. I guess just know kind of overall, and maybe I should have said this earlier, that HAND has been working closely with the city of Detroit on this whole process, as well as CSH has been providing some, technical support as well. Because these projects are development projects, and that's a little bit different than what we typically fund in the CoC world, we've been relying heavily on our city partners and their development staff to make sure that we're really getting at kind of the right questions, and that we have a sense of projects that may be in the pipeline, that may be kind of in time-wise in a position to apply for these dollars. So the city has been a great partner in putting together these efforts. But these timeline questions really reflect those timeline criteria that I referenced earlier in terms of, do you have site control? If not, when do you anticipate getting it by? Excuse me. And do you, if you do have site control, on what date what did you gain that site control? Excuse me. And then we ask for questions around where you are in the environmental review, if you've had phase 1 and or phase 2 completed. When we get to the attachment section, I'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to be looking for in terms of attachments related to the environmental review. And we ask for questions around the anticipated, the known or estimated start and completion dates for the rehab or the construction. Again, this is to help us understand if that project is going to align with those timeline expectations. When you anticipate receiving the certificate of occupancy, and when you anticipate unit occupancy to begin. So understand those last two questions may be a bit of a, again, it's going to be an estimate based on your best understanding of kind of where the project is. We know that sometimes things come up in rehab or construction projects where your timeline doesn't always go as planned. But really what we're looking for here is your best estimate at this point. Based on the information you have now and what you know now about the project, what do you anticipate? When do you anticipate getting the certificate of occupancy? And when do you anticipate being able to lease up those units? The next question asks about zoning information. So there's two different questions. There's a 2A and a 2B, depending on if the project is located in the city of Detroit or if it's located in Hamtramck or Highland Park. So I just answer appropriately, but essentially we want to know, is the property appropriately zoned for being a residential permanent supportive housing? And if not, what is the plan and anticipated timeline to get it zoned appropriately? Again, this is something that will be taken into consideration. We know that if a rezoning needs to happen, that is not something that happens overnight. There's a lot to it. So we just really need to know kind of how is that property zoned. Again, this gets into the readiness of the project. All right, so question 3, this is where we're really getting more into information about the project itself. So you see there's, kind of A through H are just sort of these ticking off those points, tell us about this project. And also when we get into question 3 and then going forward, you're going to see some guidance in terms of word limits to the responses. These are word limits, not character limits. For those of you that do stuff in eSnaps, these are word limits. We put these word limits in there. Number one, to try to keep this, again, a little bit more manageable for you while writing, to know like we're not looking for you to write, pages and pages here. Also for those of on the back end who are going to be reviewing them, again, to try to kind of keep these applications manageable. So please be mindful of those word limits as you're developing your responses. But essentially question 3, we're looking for information about the site, the number of units, how many units are for permanent supportive housing, how many units are for affordable housing. Do you have those both types of those units in the same building? Getting into questions around if the building is currently in use, if the building had a different use. One thing that HUD is interested in is converting projects or converting buildings that may not have been, a residential building into permanent supportive housing. So HUD is interested in like taking a hotel or a school or some other type of building and converting it into permanent supportive housing. So we do have a question around, is this building being converted from a different use? So again, questions about the project itself. I want to take a moment. There's a couple of, I think, relevant questions here in the chat that I want to respond to. So one question is, can it be a congregate care or can it be scattered sites? So the expectation is that this is going to be a project-based or kind of a site-based permanent supportive housing project, and that all of the units are going to be in one building. Again, because the majority of the funding that is requested is for new construction or rehabilitation. So that is going to happen, assumedly, within one specific site or one specific building, where then those PSH units will be. So question, if this is a LIHTC, would the service provider be the lead agency or the entity that would be providing services under this grant? So I think, right, we're using some kind of LIHTC language in this. So if your question is in terms of who is the applicant for these funds, I would say that is really going to be up to you as the applicant to determine who makes the most sense to be the actual applicant, and then would be to be the one who would then receive these dollars. Again, both locally and with HUD, they're going to be looking at the experience that the applicant has on developing permanent supportive housing. So if the service provider in and of themselves maybe has experience providing supportive services in permanent supportive housing, but doesn't have the experience in developing those projects, then they may need to look at see if it makes more sense for the developer to be the applicant. So I think you're really going to have to kind of think that through in terms of who does it make most sense to be the sort of named applicant for these funds, because it may be different than who you've identified as the lead agency for your LIHTC, or it may be the same. I'm not sure if I can answer that better than that. And then for clarification, it is a 750 word limit for A through H. 750 words is more than one page typically. So again, we're hopeful that that will be plenty. And for most of these kind of points in these questions, we're just looking for like a quick hit. Tell us the basics about it. Another question, is there a PSH unit cost per household that we view as reasonable? So what's the reasonable cost per household? So we don't have that detailed out here. You know, I would really encourage you to think through, what we do have, this might be kind of getting to it, an expected client to case manager to client ratio of 1 to 15. That is in alignment with current best practices as it relates to project-based permanent supportive housing. So if you think through, you know, a 1 to 15 ratio, if you have, so you have a project that has 30 units, we're going to be expecting there to be at least 2 full-time case managers. You'll then likely have, you know, you may have like project management staff, other staff that will need to be, you know, part of that budget. We also really encourage you to consider, you know, appropriate pay scales for your case management staff, you know, making sure that those are competitive and attractive to potential job candidates. So thinking kind of through that as you put together your budget. So question 4, I think this kind of gets to the earlier question about the applicant. So again, question 4 is asking for information on the applicant entity in developing permanent supportive housing or affordable housing that is, again, similar in size of scope to the projects being proposed in this application. So we tried to make this response hopefully as easy as possible. We've developed these tables. So what we're looking for, so again, whoever the applicant is on your application, what we are asking for is up to 5 of the most recent projects that they have been a part of. Most recent 5, not including the one that is being applied for here. And so we made 5 different tables that each one of them asks for the exact same information, information on where's that project located, what was the applicant's role in that project, who was the developer, service provider, property manager. You know, some of these could be the same. If the applicant is the developer, then, you know, the applicant's role in the project was the developer and the developer was the applicant. That could be an example. Could be the service provider. Again, that's going to depend on who you identify as the applicant. Then we just want information on those in that project, the number of units, how many of those units were permanent supportive housing, what was the target population, looking for kind of a summary of what were some of the major funding sources that went into that project for capital, operations, and services, not asking for, you know, detailed budget, but really we're trying to get a sense of, you know, of these different projects that the applicant has been a part of, how are they funded? And does that align with the project that's being proposed here? So there are 5 of these tables. If your applicant doesn't have 5 past projects to provide experience with, that's fine. We're really just asking for up to 5. So, and again, the questions in each table is the same. You can leave any tables that you don't use. You can just leave blank. Okay, scrolling down to the next question. Let me switch over to these are great questions that you're dropping in the chat, so thank you. Please keep them coming. So the question is, does the applicant need to be a member of the Detroit CoC? So no, we don't require being a member of the CoC in order for them to apply. Obviously, I think I mentioned this earlier, the project site itself has to be within the Detroit CoC jurisdiction of Detroit, Hamtramck, or Highland Park. Hopefully that's pretty obvious. We're talking about Detroit projects here. So it's a note, I see someone did have to leave early. Just a reminder, the PowerPoint, the slides and the recording will be posted to our website within by probably early next week. Jamie, your question, does the project need to be completed or can it be in process? So when you say completed, so there's going to have to be a need for some capital dollars, and I often think of this as rehab dollars. If you have a project where you're at a point where you don't have any substantial need for more rehab dollars, probably, then that project is probably not going to be very competitive. Again, the majority of the funds requested do need to be for those capital costs. If you don't have those capital costs remaining, if your project is far enough down the road where you're like, we've done all the rehab, or maybe we're almost done doing the rehab, we don't really have much of a gap in our rehab, need, then that's not going to be a very competitive project because there will be nothing to really spend those rehab dollars on.
Amanda, I'm not asking about for this current project that we're asking for funds. I'm asking for the experience. Like if we're in the process of rehabbing or constructing a new building, can we use that as experience?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying.
No, I just wanted to give you a chance to speak because someone might have that question, but that was my question.
Yep. So when you're doing these experience, if it is something that is still in process, and you can see we one of the question is the anticipated or actual month and year when the project's going to be leasing up. So if it is still in process and you're like, we're not going to lease up until, next year, you can just indicate that there and one will know, obviously it's still in the works. But yeah, thanks for clarifying, Jamie. Sorry, I went down the rabbit trail. Okay. The next question gets into ask for information about the experience of the property manager for who's going to be associated with this project that you're applying for. So again, you see at the beginning here, we kind of have this assumption that that project manager has been identified, but you'll see there is a question after this that if you have not yet identified who the property management company is going to be for this particular project, then you can provide a response on essentially what are the qualifications you would look for, what is your expected timeline to identify who that property manager will be. But if you do already know who will be the property manager, then we're going to want this, again, experience information about them. This is really, again, we're trying to pull together all the information around who are kind of the key partners in these projects. So similar to the other question, there's 5 tables looking for the, kind of 5 most recent projects that project property manager has been a part of. Again, to the point earlier, if it's one that is still, in process of being developed, that can be provided as well. But this again is really just helping us to understand, is this an entity that has experience managing permanent supportive housing properties, or are they new to this world? So you can see, again, asking for kind of the 5 most recent. And then we have this question here, again, this optional narrative. If for this project in particular that you are applying for, if you've not yet identified the property manager, just please describe to us how you will identify who that entity is, the timeline, and the process that you'll use to identify them. All right, question 6 gets into the service provider experience, and this is more of a narrative response. So you can probably tell for, I think, what am I trying to say? There is an assumption that at this point, at least the service provider has been identified for these projects. We understand the property management may not quite have been identified yet, but we anticipate that at this point with the projects, who the service provider will be. So we are looking for information on that service provider's experience. And then really, again, the reason why we're drilling in on this is because of the expectation that you will be requesting supportive services funding to support these projects. So we want to know who will that provider be. Question 7 gets into the service model description. So again, you have these different bullet points that you're going to need to respond to. Again, there is a word limit here, so we're really asking you to kind of keep these responses concise. We're hopeful that we did find this, balance between giving you room to write while also not asking for, again, pages and pages. But for the service model, again, this is going to obviously relay back to the service provision, really tell us about what the services that are going to be provided within this project and the staffing structure, use of peer supports, how you'll incorporate best practices like trauma-informed care and housing first, motivational interviewing. So really wanted to, peel back some of those layers on the supportive services. This question about client to case manager ratio. I mean, it's a pretty simple question. There's really only kind of 2 parts of it that need to be answered. And we really want to know what is going to be the client to case manager ratio for this project. Again, we are looking at the current best practice of a 1 to 15 ratio. So the extent to which an applicant can indicate they will have that 1 to 15 ratio will score higher. That doesn't mean that you'll not be considered at all if that ratio is higher, but that is, we're kind of landing at that 1 to 15 again as the best practice and is really what we ideally would want to see. Questions 9, 10, and 11 are really asking for information around how did the applicant, kind of key project partners, go about getting input into the development and the design of this project. Well, maybe I'll start with question 9, particularly around incorporating the viewpoints of people with lived experience of homelessness in the design of the project, and whether that's the kind of physical design, the supportive services design. We really want to see evidence that as these plans were being put into place, that there was an intentional process to get input and to use the input of the community who is going to be served by the project, meaning people who are experiencing homelessness. So that is, aligns with one of our values of centering the voices of people with lived experience. And so we're really looking for information on how the project approached that. Questions 10 and 11 align with questions that HUD is going to be looking for in kind of the larger application. So we incorporated them here. And we're looking for experience that the applicant or the project partners have with building community partnerships with grassroots organizations, and then also experience with designing and operating programs that have improved racial equity, particularly amongst people experiencing homelessness. So again, questions 10 and 11 align with what HUD is looking for. And again, these align with some of our goals as a CoC. And so we've incorporated them here as well. Okay, yep, thank you, Lauren. So question 12, and this gets into the question around the gaps in funding for capital and or supportive services gaps. Again, that's what these funds are to be used for. So we are going to be asking for information on what are these gaps that you have in your funding for either capital costs or supportive services costs. So we do really, so this is kind of a narrative where we're looking for a written response. Again, we're not looking in sort of the narrative piece. Again, pages and pages. When you get to the attachments, you'll also see where we do ask for attachments kind of getting to the same question as well regarding the budget and the gaps. But this is a way to sort of describe what are those gaps in your capital costs that these CoC Builds fund would fill. What are the gaps in the services costs that these CoC Builds fund would fill as well. Okay, question 13 gets into question 13 and 14 get into some leveraging questions. And these are likewise questions that are reflected in the larger application that is going to be submitted to HUD. So in our attempts to be a little bit proactive, we're incorporating them here. Question 13 is asking about leveraging non-CoC housing resources to this project. We're particularly interested if this project is going to be receiving home dollars, LIHTC, project-based rentals, project-based vouchers, or MISHDA PSH gap funding. So we've tried the best attempt to make this, again, as easy as possible to fill out. So we developed this chart. If you need to add more lines to this chart, you can do so. But really what we're looking for, again, these are other non-CoC sources of funding that are coming into the project. I realize right now that because I'm showing the PDF, I can't show you these drop downs, but essentially we're asking for what is the name of this funding source? What is the total amount? How is this funding source to be used? There's a drop down menu here, and you can essentially select from acquisition, new construction, rehab, or rental assistance, or operating. Those are kind of the 5 items that you can select from that drop down menu. Then just asking if the source is committed. If it's not yet committed, have you applied for it? If you've applied for it but not been awarded, when do you expect to be awarded? And then if that source is providing rental subsidies, how many subsidies will be provided? So we tried to make this hopefully as straightforward as possible. I do explain that if you have perhaps one funding source that is covering kind of multiple costs, you can indicate that one, you can indicate it kind of twice in that chart, one amount for what cost and then another amount for another cost. But again, this is our attempt to really understand what are these sources of non-CoC housing resources that are coming into the project. Again, this is something that HUD is going to be looking for ultimately in their applications that they're going to fund. Similarly, very similar chart, only where this is now on the services side, asking about non-CoC services and or healthcare. So services of funding, which could include Medicaid reimbursement as a source to cover, pay for some of the costs of supportive services. So the chart itself is set up like the other one. This drop-down menu, those funds, it's going to be different. It's going to be more related to supportive services. Sorry, I don't have that here, but it's going to be, case management support, behavioral health support, physical care, other types of services that the individual may be receiving. So just looking for that there. And I want to address a question that I think that has come up in the past when we've talked about this, leveraging other services funding in terms of what does this mean when we also have housing first approach where you cannot require someone to participate in services. So say you have a source of funding that's going to provide outpatient healthcare, or maybe you have a partnership with an FQHC that they'll provide services for your residents and you're able to document that amount. But what if the people that you serve don't want to go to that FQHC? They don't want to go to that particular clinic. You can still show this as a source of leveraging to this project, even if the client does not avail themselves of that opportunity. It's not intended to be, these are the sources that we're requiring our clients to take advantage of. That question has come up in the past, so I just wanted to address that. Hopefully that didn't make things more confusing. Okay. Question 15 gets into the budget and the match. So this is where we have a question around if you intend to, number one, if you would meet those MISHDA match requirements, and if you intend to utilize that MISHDA match opportunity. So kind of again, a yes or no. If no, then we do want to know what source or sources of funding you intend to use for match. You will also put that match information in the funding request spreadsheet. Okay, I want to go over the required attachments. So the first attachment is how much money you're requesting. So that's the spreadsheet, which I'll go over in a minute. Attachment 2 your documentation of site control. So again, as you saw, also kind of on the checklist page, if there's any attachments that don't apply, you can indicate that they're not applicable. Environmental review documentation. This may seem a little broad, but we're basically asking for anything you have related to the environmental review, whether it's for your phase 1 review and or phase 2 and or the results of any of that review. Send us what you have. And again, just to be transparent, we're going to be working with the city of Detroit, their environmental review folks, to review this documentation. Again, it is likely they are already aware of your project and what type of environmental reviews have already been done or where you are in that process. So we're going to be collaborating closely with them as we review this documentation and as we get a sense of project readiness. Again, that's really what this is pointing to, is project readiness. If you are in a position where you have not done any environmental reviews at all, at this point, it may be more challenging for your project to be selected, just because we know the time that it can take to get those reviews done, and then all of the things that come up when you do the environmental review, all the things that you discover about the site. So the long-winded way of saying, send us whatever you have for the environmental review. Also, feel free to reach out to me, and if you have a question about a particular thing on whether or not to submit it, I'd be happy to provide additional guidance. Attachment 4, if you have already written out a tenant selection criteria, so for example, if you have this developed for like a LIHTC application or another funder's application, that tenant selection criteria for this project, please submit that. We know you may not be at that point yet, so if you don't have it, you can just select NA. For attachments 5 and attachment 6 are similar, where we're looking for attachment 5, we're looking for the capital and operating budget. So again, a comprehensive budget for the capital and operating for this project. And again, we do ask that you kind of highlight within there where the gaps exist, so that helps us to understand how these CoC Builds fund would be used. If you have a budget that you've already prepared and submitted to another funder, like the City of Detroit or to MISTA, you can submit that same thing to us. Not necessarily looking for you to like recreate the wheel and something there. You likely, again, our assumption is at this point, you probably already have this type of information together, and so you can submit to us what you have. Same thing with the supportive services budget. Want to know kind of what the full supportive services budget is and really kind of where those gaps exist. For match documentation, we ask that if you have it, that you provide match documentation. Again, for those of you who applied for new CoC funding in the regular competition, you know that we make this an optional attachment. If you have it, please include it. It could be similar or the same to another attachment you've already attached. Please still include it. If you don't have match documentation, that's okay. We will want to know what is the source of the match, but we know depending on the source of the match, you may or may not have something physical to attach. Particularly if you intend to pursue the MISTA match opportunity, you're not going to have anything to submit. The last attachment is the signature page. The signature page needs to be signed by the applicant, the service, and really any subrecipients, I should say. So these are really just the affirmation that you understand, if funded, you'll comply with kind of all of these requirements, the CoC regulatory requirements, HMIS, coordinated entry. Also, kind of point number 5, that you understand that the grant agreement, if funded, we expect it to be executed by next September, and that you do intend to execute that grant agreement and carry out the project. And that this is not just something that you're going to change your mind on down the road. There is also a point to this, sorry, point number 1. The signature also indicates you understand that if you are selected through this phase 1, that you will then complete the full process for that phase 2 and write that much broader, fuller application to HUD. Just want to make that clear that you understand that if you're selected, this is only the first piece of the pie, first piece of the puzzle, I guess. So the signature page, again, it has room for the applicant, and then I just indicated a spot for 3 subrecipients. If you have a bunch more subrecipients, you can create additional signature lines. The appendices in the application, the first appendix is the evaluation criteria. So this goes over what the reviewers are going to be looking for when they evaluate your projects. I'm not going to go again into really all of the details on this, but you are encouraged to reference this as you work through your application and kind of think through what is going to result in a higher score with what will be a more competitive application. Appendix B, this is the kind of the final 5 or 6 pages here. I just pulled this information over from HUD's NOFO, again, just to make everyone aware of, if you are selected, this is the narrative that you're going to have to write and respond to for HUD. So I give sort of all of those details there. There's nothing that you need to submit by September 30th that responds to anything in this, Appendix B. This is simply just to keep you informed. This may also be helpful for you as you read through this and think through, because again, whatever's put in this narrative response to HUD, that's what HUD is going to evaluate to make their decision nationally. So just kind of think through, could I even be competitive on a national basis, given what HUD is going to be looking for in this narrative response? I will say this, HUD frames this as a 25-page narrative that needs to be written. The reality is that's a double spaced. So going back to when, I had to write things double, like 12 pages, right? 25 pages is 12 pages double spaced. So maybe it's not as intimidating as it seems to be. But again, we provide that there just to you're familiar with what needs to be written. In addition to that longer narrative response, there are 3 supplemental narratives that the selected applicant will need to write. These are not scored by HUD. They're additional information that HUD is looking for on how the applicant is advancing racial equity, affirmatively marketing and outreaching for the project, and then affirmatively furthering fair housing. And there's additional guidance is given there. If you are selected to move forward to phase 2, we can certainly provide some additional guidance with writing some of those narratives as well. Okay, before I move to the funding request spreadsheet, let me see. Okay, thank you, Lauren, for responding to Jamie's question. Jamie, let us know if that answered the question or not. Okay. I want to switch over and talk through this funding request spreadsheet. So this, again, it needs to be submitted with your application. This is where you're essentially putting together the entire request of how much money you're asking for in this CoC Builds application. The spreadsheet is posted to our website that I posted. Okay, circle back to Jamie's question. The operating costs get lumped in. Jamie, are you able to come off mute? That might be easier to just make sure we're understanding.
Yeah, so there's 2 budgets, right? And according to like a few slides ago, I believe it said that operating and like capital is separated from supportive services. And I would think that capital costs would be in with the supportive services. So I'm just confused, and I'm like, I just want to make sure that when we complete our budgets, we're doing it correctly.
That capital costs. So
it just seems strange that like operating costs for a PSH program would be more so in line with the supportive service budget, because that's how you do them when you do PSH grants. And I just want to ensure that obviously the operating costs that are required to operate a PSH project are carried forward when we do renewal projects. And it's just weird that it's in with the capital instead of with the supportive service.
I see. So I would say, and I would welcome input from Lauren or anyone else that's been a part of this, if you, if it makes more sense for you that operating and services is one budget and capital is another budget, you can submit it that way. Just maybe.
Oh, I thought it had to be two separate budgets.
This is really for our purposes to understand where the gaps are.
So it is one budget and we just have to make sure we're itemizing it.
Yes, I mean, really what so for attachments 5 and 6, really what we are looking for is we want to understand what are the gaps in your budget, what are the gaps in the capital costs, because there have to be gaps in order to get the CoC Builds fund.
Right.
And what are the gaps in your services budget that these funds would fill? So if you, and again, we're also honestly coming at this with a perspective that you probably already have something like this in place. Or hopefully you do.
No, we absolutely do. But like,
Okay.
you know, like with development costs, like usually those are totally separate budgets. Like we have an overall development cost for a project we're working on, right?
Yeah.
And gaps there. And then obviously, like when you're writing for a supportive, if you don't have supportive services currently funded, you obviously already know what the gaps will be there, right? But usually, like my understanding was that attachment 5 and attachment 6 had to be two separated budget, like two totally separate budgets. And I was just trying to understand why operating dollars wouldn't be with supportive services versus capital.
Yeah. You know, there was we put it together the way we did. But if again, so if it makes more sense for you to submit them how you have it with, and that operating are reflected in the supportive services, that's fine. I would ask maybe if you could just include a note with that or something so that we know, hey, when we look at attachment 5, this is just capital. But then when we look at attachment 6, okay. You see operating and services there.
It was just more for clarification for as I put these together. I want to ensure that I'm not making a mistake or like getting points deducted for not following rules. Like it's just easier sometimes when you're doing a supportive service budget to create like, you know, to include all the operation expenses as well.
Yep, that's fine. I see Linda's agreement too. So that's fine. Again, you know, I think what we're seeing here, there's a sort of a reflection of this is a bit of a newer type of projects than what we typically fund. So I think we're at a learning curve here. I see.
Yeah, and I didn't even know, you know, and I'm newer on the development side, so I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding that there's not like, you know, there could be technically operational expenses as it applies to capital as well.
Yeah.
Like, and so I don't know. So I just thank you for the clarification. I think I got it.
Okay. All right. Great, thank you. And I will say too, and Jamie, to kind of to a prior point, I think one thing that we are being mindful of too, as we go into this application process, is that it's likely, not likely, there's a chance that based on what an applicant submits, we may need to go back and ask for further clarification or further details on what was submitted. And if that needs to happen, that's not going to be a penalty to the applicant. So it's a little bit different than maybe, again, your kind of typical CoC application process where if you don't get this in on time, you're going to be, you know, knocked points. So it's maybe a little bit more, not quite like that. We know that there may be a bit of back and forth in, okay, you submitted this certain attachment. We have some questions. What is this really saying? So we are, I think, are kind of anticipating that, if that sort of alleviates some concern, I guess. Oh, yes, and thank you, Michael. Right. Operating and services are renewable. Yep. Yes, and thank you, Lindsay, for that point too. So, okay, hope that has all been helpful. All right, I want to take a few moments to walk through. So this is the spreadsheet that you are going to be submitting. The numbers that you put here in this spreadsheet are just the CoC Builds funding that's being requested and what you're going to be using for match. So let me just kind of, what I'm showing you here is an example of one I've kind of already filled out, just to give you a sense of how this spreadsheet works. So the first tab is just instructions that you can refer back to on how the subsequent tabs work. One thing to keep in mind throughout this spreadsheet, any orange cells are going to automatically populate. There's formulas written in those cells. So for the most part, you're not going to type anything into the orange cells. The blue cells are where you're going to be typically asked to enter information. So there's three tabs that you're going to be entering information in: tab B, C, and E. So let me start with, make this a little bit smaller. So tab B is the overall summary request. And so this is where you're going to need to go into this having a sense of how many years are you requesting funding for. Again, it can be 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. And what are the costs that you're going to be requesting? I don't know that I've mentioned this earlier, maybe I should have, that you cannot request both project-based rental assistance and operating. Those are two budget lines that cannot coexist together in one project. That is a regulatory requirement. So if you are thinking of, requesting one or both of those, you can only request one of them. One project cannot have both a project-based rental assistance and operating in that same project, just as a side note. But what I tried to lay out kind of in this summary budget, again, is the year of that grant term, year of that that those funds would be spent. Again, to give you a sense of the terms of the grants, the allowable costs, and again, the years that they would be spent. So to the point that it came up earlier, again, I think Jamie brought up this point. If you are requesting like rehab costs, so in this example, years 1 and year 2, I intend to be spending a pretty significant amount of funding on rehab, with the plans that by the end of year 2, so by the end of 2027, I'm going to be ready to start providing supportive services and using some funds for operating. Well, then you're going to see those dollars come into play in years 3, 4, and 5. So I'm not budgeting for supportive services in years 1 and year 2, because I'm not going to be providing supportive services in year 1 and year 2. Year 1 and year 2 are just rehab. For your budget, it may be just year 1. Maybe you only have 1 more year to do rehab. Then years 2 and 3 are services. So again, you're going to kind of have to figure this out in terms of what makes sense for your project. But really the point being that it's anticipated that your capital costs, you're going to be budgeting for those in the first couple of years before you start budgeting for those costs that you're going to incur once people are moved into the building.
Amanda, I have a question.
Sure.
And I'm sorry if I'm interrupting. Okay, so I know you said that it can be anywhere from a 2-year to a 5-year grant term for this.
Yep.
But if we're like, just say we're only requesting $1 million or $2 million for actual like new construction or rehab, then obviously let's go with 200,000 or 2 million.
Okay.
Well, then we would only be able to request $400,000 for like supportive services, because it can only be 20%.
Right.
So then we would only necessarily be able to do like maybe a 3-year grant term versus a 5, because we wouldn't be able to like request any more, supportive services, because we only requested $2 million for rehab or construction. So with that being the case, would that mean that year 4 or year 3 we're applying for a renewal grant with the Detroit CoC?
Yes. So whenever
And is that allowable? Like, I guess is what I'm saying, versus a 5-year where that would obviously cover more.
So you can, is what allowable? Maybe.
Well, I mean, I guess, is it okay to do a 3-year and only request $2.5 million versus doing a 5-year requesting almost the whole amount if
Sure.
That's all we technically.
Sure. So it is allowable for you to submit whatever length of budget request you want, and it is allowable for you to request as much as you want or as little as you want. Obviously, you can't request more than $7.5 million. What we will probably take into consideration as we review these projects is this funding request is sort of one piece of the overall package of what you're submitting. I think we'll take into consideration, is this request, like, are we going to get the most out of it, the most opportunity for these funds? I mean, we need you to be honest in your request. If you only need another $1 million in rehab, then reflect that in your budget. If, you know, again, we're going to be taking that into consideration when we look at all of the applications that are received in terms of how can we get the most out of this funding opportunity that's available to us.
Thank you.
Yep. So a couple of additional things on how this sort of summary page works. Again, there's some formulas built in. So the administrative costs line 7, this automatically calculates that 10% admin. That's the maximum amount that can be requested, doing that with the assumption that projects are going to want that full 10%. So this automatically calculates it. If for whatever reason you don't want that full 10%, this is a space where you can override. You can see there's a formula there. You can override that and put in a lesser amount. I would encourage you to request the full amount, the full 10% admin. You can see these orange cells, how they total. This little box over here under column H, this is what's kind of keeping track of that 20% mark of where combined total of project-based rental assistance, operating, and supportive services can be no more than 20% of the total request. So this is sort of keeping tabs on, as you enter in these numbers, where you are with that 20%. You don't have to request the full 20%, but you cannot go over it. So in this example that I give here, as you can see, I'm requesting the full $7.5 million, about a little over $5 million of that is in rehab cost. The remaining, a little bit of operating and a little bit of supportive services. So this is, again, just an example of kind of how this summary budget works. It also calculates your total match obligation. As I referenced earlier, if you're requesting the full $7.5 million available to us, the match obligation is about close to $1.9 million. The tab C is then where we're going to get into the details of what you're requesting. So again, tab B is that kind of overall, in general, kind of give us a snapshot. Tab C is we're going to get into some more details on those budget lines. I say that with the caveat that those first 3 capital cost, acquisition, new construction, or rehab, there's not a ton of additional details you need to enter. Partly because at this point, HUD is not looking for a bunch of additional details, but let me walk you through on kind of how these detailed budgets work. So the first thing that you're going to do, let me scroll down to the rehab budget. That's the one that I'm requesting in this example. Going to enter in the blue cell that annual amount that you're requesting for rehab. So in this example, it's that almost $2.6 million. What I should have done then was typed in here a description. Just a brief description of what those rehab dollars will be used for. This does not need to be very detailed. Then you're going to enter how many of the total grant term that you're requesting. In this example, it's 5 years. How many of those years am I going to be using rehab dollars? So again, to go back to the summary budget, for 2 years, I plan to be using rehab funding. So I enter 2. And then that's going to total my total rehab request, which again, we saw is the same as what was on tab B. You're going to fill out these detailed budget forms for each of the budget lines that you're going to be requesting. So again, for operating, in this example, I requested $50,000 a year. I'm just saying that's going to be a full-time security guard. Don't put too much stake in these salary amounts or the actual numbers that I'm putting in these budgets. It's just all to get the numbers to work. But again, so my annual operating request was $50,000. I had 3 years 3, 4, and 5 of my budget was where those operating costs would be used. And so I enter that into those number of years. It comes up with my total operating request of $150,000. And then supportive services. This is the one where you're going to have probably the most detail is going to be asked for. Again, this is, for those of you who have done these types of budgets for CoC applications in the past, this should look pretty familiar. So you're going to detail out what are your supportive services going to be used for. And again, we are asking for some information here in terms of number of staff. How are you coming up with these kind of numbers that you're calculating? So in this example here, I have a certain number of staff and a program manager, saying there would be some maybe work training program fees, some food vouchers, on-site therapists, some transportation assistance, utility deposits. Again, these numbers are a little bit made up, but just to give you an example of kind of how this budget is going to come together, you're going to have your annual supportive services cost, and then you're going to enter the number of, again, the number of years in the total from the total budget. In this case, again, years 3, 4, and 5. And so then that will give me the total assistance requested. Tab D, tab D is something I put together just as a little bit of a check. If tab D is a little overwhelming, you can just ignore it. You don't need to enter any information in tab D. This was intended to pull together the information you enter in tab B and tab C, just to make sure that they match. There's all formulas built in here, so you don't need to enter anything. If you see all green yeses in this last column, that means what you put in the summary budget and what you put in the detailed budget are matching. If you see a no, that means something isn't matching. And again, you can kind of be able to see here, so you can go back and correct what needs to be done. This is an insight into how my brain works a little bit, just to, again, help you think through, okay, I'm doing this summary budget here, wanting to make sure that what I put in this detailed budget matches what I put in the summary budget, rather than having to flip back and forth between the two tabs. I pulled that information all together in tab D, so you can kind of see that at a glance, if that's helpful for you. If it's not helpful, you can just skip over tab D. The final tab, tab E, this is where you're going to indicate your match. So hopefully it's pretty straightforward. The spreadsheet will pull over the amount of match that's required for the project, and then you're going to enter what you intend to use for match. In this example, I put home funds. Again, if you intend to take advantage of the MSHDA funding, or if you have other funding source, just indicate the match, if it's cash or in kind, if it's committed, or you just estimate that it will be available for the project, the amount that's going to be used for match, how that match will be used, and if you have documentation, if you're including that with the application. The final tab, tab F, is just a reference tab. This just goes into detail. This is pulled straight from the CoC regulations, the details on what you can use allowable costs for the CoC funding. So just pulled it straight from the regs in case you're wondering kind of how you can use these dollars. Okay, let me take a minute to look at the chat. So Linda, your question, is there a number of units you have in mind? We don't necessarily have a number of units in mind to fund. Again, I think we're going to want to get the most that we can out of these dollars, but there's not necessarily a target number of units. Michael's question, any thoughts on how MSHDA or HUD will look at the 10% admin versus the developer fee? Can we get both? So Michael's question is veering into the world of developer fees that I have not a lot of expertise on. I'm a little apprehensive to answer this question because I don't want to answer it incorrectly. I may look to Lindsay if you, or even Michael might come off and provide more clarification, but Lindsay, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything from HUD, and I know that I know that MSHDA is like talking about it. That's not a very good answer though. Sorry.
All right. Sorry for the non-answer answer. I think
so.
Yeah,
so we can try. The worst is they'll say no, you're not getting both.
Can you clarify too, Michael, what you mean here? Quite frankly, I'll just show my ignorance. I'm a little unclear on what the question is asking.
On the development budget, so the capital budget, developer is allowed to get 15% developer fee, which is sort of payment for the work, for the risk, for all of that. And I don't quite know how a 10% admin fee calculated off a piece of development funding would be thought of as different. Like this admin fee just isn't part of the development world that I've ever heard identified, and it fits closest to developer fee, and so getting more than 15% is not allowable generally. So I was just curious. I mean, as I said, we'll include both and see what happens. I just didn't know if it had been talked about.
Okay, thanks. And then Linda, your question, does the value so if there's a building that's donated, does the value of that building count as match? I believe yes. I believe that would be considered an in-kind match. You would need to be able to obviously have documentation of what that value is, a dollar amount to it, because that's how they would determine if you're meeting that match requirement or not. I think the regulations might have some additional details on how donated property can be documented as match, but my understanding is that yes, it is allowable. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Okay. What other questions do folks have? And while you're considering, I'll just drop again in the chat the link to our website where everything from today will be posted. Again, the slides, the recording. If we get any additional clarification from MISTA on their match, if they put something in writing, it will be posted there as well.
Amanda, I have one more question about the budget. I'm sorry, I keep going back to that.
No, you're fine.
But so is it just one budget then? And everything's encompassed, but we just upload it twice? I'm very confused about it because it looks like the budget you just showed us encompasses everything.
Okay,
Like
so when you say everything,
yeah, but like it looks like it goes over like capital and supportive services and operations and everything. So I'm just wondering, does it have to be broken out in two separate budgets and uploaded separately, or is it one budget?
So this spreadsheet is just what you are requesting for these CoC Build dollars. So this is not intended to be, this spreadsheet here is not the full budget of your project, right? This is just to be how much of this, of the 7.5 million that's available, how much of it do you want? And how are you going to spend it if you get it?
So then the other two budgets are us like kind of detailing out exactly what we need and how it comes to this like spreadsheet.
Yes, because these other two budgets are intended to be right for what are all of the other sources and uses of funding that are coming into the project?
And are we being provided those budgets to fill in, or do we have to create our own budgets?
So we don't have a format or a template for that. I think, again, we're sort of operating with the assumption that you will have something like this.
Yeah, and I'm sure I know we do.
Yeah,
like
so we don't have a set template for you to use.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't submitting the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yep. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, my contact information is there. I'm sure you are also have it if you've received emails from me. So again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you may have. I will also give the caveat that because some of this delves into a nature of that's highly technical when it comes to project development. If you ask me a question that I can't answer, I may need to consult with people that are smarter than me to give you a clear response, but don't hesitate to ask questions. This type of application process, happy to answer any technical questions. If the question that you ask is something that a response would give you like an unfair advantage over another applicant, I may need to sort of pause on that one, but just other than that, send the questions, and we'll take it from there. Yes, and thank you. And Lindsay also suggested the HUD CoC Builds webpage. I will actually, that's a good point. I will, on our HANS website, I will also provide a link to HUD's CoC Builds website. If you have not yet read HUD's CoC Builds NOFO, please read that as well, because if your project is selected, that NOFO is going to be very important to you. So please take a moment to, more than a moment, because it's not that short. Take some time to read through it as well. Okay, if there's nothing else, thank you all for your time, for your great questions, and we will be in touch. Thanks all.